the overwhelming wave of information means cutting through the noise to shine a light on the heart of the story and making room for new perspectives. True understanding means the ability to see events from more than one side. I'm Liu Xin, and this is The Point.
As new infections decline, China's efforts to contain the COVID-19 pandemic seem to have paid off. But some governments and media networks are now accusing China of trying to, quote, control the coronavirus narrative. What is this narrative? And if so, who started it? It is just another attempt by some countries to blame China for their own failures to contain the outbreak. To find out, I'm pleased to be joined via Skype by Wang Cong, chief reporter of the Global Times in Beijing, and from Tennessee by Professor Josef Mahoney of the East China Normal University. Welcome, gentlemen. Professor Mahoney, let me go to you. On the same day, two Twitter accounts, one for the Chinese embassy in Sri Lanka and one for the Chinese ambassador to Cyprus, were suspended by Twitter. A few hours after this, his account was restored, Ambassador to Cyprus of China, Wang Cong, tweeted, after the suspension of my Twitter account on April 13th without prior notice, on the grounds of, quote, violating Twitter rules, it has been restored this morning. Twitter explained that it was flagged as spam by mistake. Twitter gave the same reason for the suspension of the other Chinese account. Is that just coincidence? If not, who is really trying to control this narrative? Professor Mahoney.
I think it's not in these two cases. Yes, I think it's not very clear in these two cases. It could be coincidence, but at the same time, we know that Twitter and Facebook have been in the press for, struggling over the question of freedom of speech versus the need to try to deal with fake news in a period of time when fake news can be deadly in the case of a virus and outbreak information. But at the same time, both Twitter and Facebook have faced increasing regulatory threats from the U.S. government. And, the U.S. government, both on the left and the right, the Democrats and the Republicans, are very much wedded to an anti-China narrative. So, it's hard to say. It's not surprising that people would be suspicious, but I'm not sure what the case is in these specific instances.
Well, there are many competing narratives out there. I want to go to my colleague Wang Cong in Beijing. We have data from two separate research projects, one undertaken by New York's Mount Sinai Hospital, showing that the first cases of COVID-19 in New York City are primarily from European and U.S. travelers. There are many theories floating around about where the virus originated, some of which are repeated by government officials and media. But isn't this a matter for scientists, not politicians, to determine? So why are people who are not qualified to comment on such issues being so vocal about it?
Well, politics and blaming game, as you pointed, these are theories, and there are a lot of theories, and a lot of them have nothing to do with science. And this all started with the White House, how they painted the whole pandemic as something that China created, in the White House, in the U.S. Congress, that it was somehow that a lab in Wuhan, spread this. So it all started from there, and then it kind of got a snowballing effect. Everybody jumped on because this is a sensational story. So all the U.S. media got on. So then where we're at, like you said, this is a purely scientific issue, and there are a lot of research and development has to be done to trace the origin of the coronavirus. However, this is not the top priority for now, not for anybody, not for the U.S., not for China, not for the world, because right now it's the focus should be on the containment in the U.S. It's the mitigation. So it is really unhelpful, but we have to say it's unfortunate. It started with U.S. politicians, elected officials in the Congress spreading basically conspiracy theories, and then the White House, start with President Trump Trump, who called it Wuhan virus. Because, this is not about, when Trump used it, this is not about where it came from and it's scientific, it would help, the anti-epidemic efforts. It's about shifting blames because we're seeing what's happened in the U.S. It's unfortunate, but it has a lot to do with their policy, their botched policy. So that's where we begin. That's where we're at. Very unfortunate, actually.
Talking about shifting blames, Professor Mahoney, the White House decided to halt funding to the WHO, criticizing the organization of covering up the outbreak and favoring China at the expense of America. How should we interpret that narrative of the White House? I mean, why the stopping of the funding now?
Well, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, I was a public health officer with U.S. Centers for Disease Control. And one of the things that struck me in my tenure there was how intensely political public health always is. I mean, we would think that it would, categorically be something scientific, that is fundamentally medical, that's fundamentally concerned about people's well-being, but it is always political. It's always ideological. Now, in the broader sense, to build on some of what the other guest has mentioned, before the outbreak, there was already this entrenched anti-China narrative, and it was really being driven by two things. One is this deep fear that Trump has tried to exploit and has built his whole brand on, this Make America Great Again campaign, because there was this fear and perception that America was in some form of decline. Meanwhile, China has been rising, and so it's been very convenient to blame China for exploiting, for taking advantage of the United States and pushing the U.S. down on its way to rise. And of course, this has continued under the outbreak with COVID-19. As the other guest noted, we have had not a very good response here to the outbreak, and there have been trenchant of efforts to blame others. This includes, of course, as we've already noted, blaming China, but now blaming WHO. And you almost saw this being tested in, a few balloons went up a week or so ago, and it took hold in the conservative media. And once he saw that was going to be popular, then he came back to it, despite saying that he wasn't going to suspend. So it's a scapegoat for our own shortcomings, and in particular, some of the blame that's now coming back to rest on his shoulders for deal with this on the front end.
Wang Cong, some overseas Chinese have experienced unfair treatment as a result of the outbreak, being harassed, called names, even attacked at times. Do you think the anti-China narrative pushed by Washington and echoed by some mainstream U.S. media made racism there worse?
Well, definitely start with the name calling, Chinese virus. Of course, that kind of fear-mongering names and, headlines would, further worsen those paranoia and fear already, held by many in the United States. So with the types of rhetoric in the news media and in the White House top officials, officially it gives, I'm not going to say it's a green light, but it kind of helps them. It kind of, push these people to further into their, paranoia of China rising, and China is this evil country that is spreading this virus to kill everybody. I mean, it's just ridiculous when I see some of these news reports, because they would not, including U.S. mainstream media, what they would print about China, what's happening here, they would never print those about the within the U.S. because they will be challenged, because there will be protest. But here in China, it seems that they can print anything, anything about about anything here, and they will not get challenged by it. So that's why it kind of let this spread of in the U.S. media, it's anti-China, ideologically based, and then that kind of shifted it towards paranoia and this racism. So they do have to bear the the blame for these types of rhetoric, because they created the overall environment, the political environment about people's perception of China, Chinese people, even the Asian communities there. So,
Professor Mahoney, this is the question I've always wanted to find answers to. America and American NGOs have been, let's be honest, generous on many occasions through the past century in rebuilding its allies, offering aid to poor countries globally. USAID comes to mind. Why is it that when the U.S. is doing this, it's called international development, and when China does it, it's called propaganda and influence peddling?
Well, I think it's really difficult to rationalize behavior that at this point has become pathological. Fear and paranoia about China, as I mentioned earlier, pre-existed the outbreak, and it is only intensified with it. So, anything that China does at this point is being looked at suspiciously. And again, this is by a lot of, and I'm speaking primarily from the American perspective, a lot of Americans who ought to know better. I hate to turn this into a personal thing, but I've lived in China for the better part of 20 years. It's an area of expertise for me academically. I have a lot of friends and colleagues in the United States who've never been to China, and they consistently want to explain to me what the real China is, even though all of their information is coming from second, third, fourth hand. All of it's coming through these various filters that are feeding on this fear and paranoia. And I think the real fundamental issue is people are terrified of looking at themselves. They're terrified of looking at themselves critically and trying to figure out what they have done wrong and what their responsibility is for fixing things, because they don't really have good answers to that at this point.
Well, Wang Cong, in Beijing, there are reports in some parts of the foreign media saying that some countries praise China because they get aid from China. By that logic, wouldn't every country offering aid be engaging in bribery? I mean, why is China singled out for helping other countries?
Yeah, you mentioned that it's very important because they say praise China. They didn't use the word bribery, but that's what they're insinuating by printing all these stories. Is somehow that there's a quid pro quo going on where China sending masks, and then in return you have to say something positive about China and about China's efforts. However, that's not happened. They know it because they have never, of all the hundreds of articles printed about China, using the mask as a diplomatic tool, they have never provided any evidence of China asking specific country or official to praise China, as a condition to offer assistance. They have never. They said French government may have been pressured, but they come out and denied it. So it is very delicate. They know that what they're printing is not right. That's why they say they demand praise because China helped them. They didn't say bribery or as a quid pro quo, but that's what they're insinuating. And this is what I don't get. And a couple of questions. If China stops to sending masks to these countries, who would step in? I mean, U.S. has been the leader for the last few decades, to helping in terms of international crisis, but it has not. It has been focused on the domestic, and also it has been playing a counterproductive role in this crisis. So China has to step up. If China didn't step up, not only that people on the front line, medical workers, China sending millions of masks each day. If they don't have masks, what would that do? What would that do to healthcare workers around the world? And then this thing about China using this to gain influence. These things happen naturally. Nobody anticipated this. China, in the officials and the public have been talking to, nobody's viewing this as a way of showing China's strength. More so, it's about humanity. People are proud of how China is conducting itself out of this. So I don't get it. It's not about influencing. It's about the natural process. We're helping.
Wang Cong, my friend, thank you so much for your perspective. And also I want to thank Josef Mahoney. And that would do it for this edition Off the Point. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download the CGTN app to watch our show. I'm Wang Guan, sitting in for Liu Xin. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.